When prompted, the main modern literary figure that will be brought up when discussing the modern concept of the superhero will be Nietzsche. Looking at the first superhero ever put to print, you'll see a direct reference to Nietzsche's work. Superman is a direct reference to the Übermensch, a concept penned by Nietzsche, which literally translates to Superman. This is normally credited as the conceptual origin of DC's first hero, originally being painted as somewhat of a villainous, ominous figure that was later heroicized into the Superman that we have today. While the two concepts have drifted apart as time has gone on, I feel like this is a limited reading of history. It is a misreading of the origin of the superhero. What if I told you that the first superhero ever put to page by Marvel was not a Nietzschean Übermensch, a man above men? Instead, Marvel's first hero was a Frankenstein story. Hi, I'm George Westcott, but let's go back a bit. For the record, throughout this entire video, I'll be using footage from the Marvels comic, not Marvel, Marvels, which was written by Kurt Busiek and painted beautifully by Alex Ross. The backstory that I will be retelling of this character will be heavily influenced by this version of the story, and I will draw from supplemental tellings as the story necessitates. What we know for certain is that the Human Torch first appeared in Marvel's #1 in 1939. This was Marvel, formerly known as Timely Comics' first hero. However, there is some grayness in this. It's not 100% certain on whether or not the Human Torch as a character was made first. There is some debate on whether the Human Torch was made as a response to another character that appeared in this comic, Namor the Submariner. Yet, the Human Torch is on the cover, and it's the first story told in the comic, and hence he is normally referred to as Marvel's first hero. This comic would be so successful that it would lead to a solo run of comics for the Human Torch and would keep him throughout the Golden Age during the 1940s as one of the big three Marvel heroes. The Human Torch as a character is not to be confused, however, with Johnny Storm, the member of the Fantastic Four, that Human Torch. This is a separation that I will talk about more in depth later on in this video, but the version that we're talking about today is Jim Hammond. Okay, so we open in a lab, and Dr. Phineas Horton is making a man. His lifelong passion and self-appointed role in this world was this creation of an android, a robotic humanoid. Horton was considered one of the greatest minds in scientific history, both in robotics and engineering. Specifically, however, above just robotics and engineering, Dr. Horton had a very specialized understanding of the human mind. In this lab, he toiled at his project on his perfect android. However, the android was imperfect. There was a fatal flaw. When the android awoke, the first feeling that he had was not of the air around him. It was instead his body suddenly reacting to the oxygen and lighting him aflame. Jim Hammond's first memory was of fire, of burning in a tank. His fire did not harm Jim Hammond though. Instead, it consumed the rest of the oxygen as a horrified Dr. Horton watched his android suddenly burst aflame with its first glimmer of life. Dr. Horton figured out that he had made something revolutionary. He decided to demonstrate this creation in front of a live audience. As the curtains were drawn, Jim Hammond was put on display in front of a crowd of reporters and scientists. The reporters sneered at the doctor, asking whether or not he was playing a joke on them and just putting a man on display. As they questioned, Dr. Horton knew that this was his chance, and Jim Hammond, with his second flicker of consciousness, became a light again. The crowd did not believe it at first. They asked if the doctor had just grabbed a mannequin and covered it in kerosene. When Jim Hammond started to move, though, putting his hands against the glass dome, they finally understood what was in front of them. As Jim Hammond himself puts it, they were terrified of my peculiar ability. Crowds considered him too much of a public danger. A man on fire could cause endless devastation. The public demanded for the Human Torch to be destroyed, much to the protest of Dr. Horton. Instead, they put the Human Torch in a concrete prison in the ground, somewhere where he couldn't hurt anyone. Jim Hammond had been exiled from humanity as much as possible. The only comfort that was given to the Human Torch was a headset directly connected to Dr. Horton, where he could communicate and teach his creation information. The touch, the smells, the things on the surface, the people on the surface. He would not so easily let his creation go into the night. The confines, however, did not sit right with Jim Hammond. He was essentially born and given nothing but scared reactions, nothing but ostracism from the world at large. He had been given life and with the same speed was sent right back into the darkness. Jim Hammond considered Dr. Horton his father, but did Dr. Horton consider Jim Hammond his son? He needed that freedom. He knew that one day he would be free again. He knew that he would be released from his concrete cage. It was then that his salvation came. A small crack in the stone, allowing for a glimmer of oxygen to be let into his confines, allowing for the Human Torch to burn again. Flames burst from the concrete hole that Jim Hammond had been put in. Dr. Horton called out, hoping to bring his creation back to him. Instead, in fear of being imprisoned again, Jim Hammond ran into the night. He tasted freedom for the first time. Only he was again met with fear. The expressions that had followed him in every single waking moment that he had. The only thought in that moment as he ran into the night was the hope that his life, his newfound existence, would spark a new age, that his birth brought the dawn of the age of miracles. So I think about this story a lot. The comic begins with a direct quote from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The original 1930s comic does not start with this quote, but the influence from Frankenstein can be felt throughout the entire work. It draws a lot of inspiration from Pulp Fiction, which was deeply inspired by Frankenstein and its imitators. The Human Torch, with this quote in mind, is inexorably framed as a Frankenstein's monster, essentially reframing the idea of the superhero in this context. Though where Frankenstein's monster was abandoned on fear alone, the Human Torch was abandoned mostly through pressure from society. That society itself was afraid of the Human Torch, and because of this, Dr. Horton was forced to imprison his creation. The modern idea of the superhero is deeply rooted in some form of inequality, and in how we seemingly need things bigger than ourselves. Human Torch, especially in this tiny prologue of a chapter, reframes this concept as something that we would logistically fear, that we would treat the superhero, this other, as something of a danger. The idea of the burning man is one of the most extreme images that is in the cultural geist, only seen in the most violent and extreme scenarios. The burning man is a fundamentally violent image. Self-immolation, or burning yourself to death, is seen as possibly the most radical form of protest on shock factor alone. It is an image of death, an image that shocks us and we naturally fear. The Human Torch seemingly draws from these images. In some way, it challenges our notions of what an other would look like. Classic monster narrative draws from our natural fear of the other, the creature in the night. Yet, drawing from Frankenstein, which actively forces us to sympathize with the creature, it is posed as a narrative question towards the idea of the superhero, especially this early on, sympathizing with that which shocks us. The superhero, in contrast, is an empathetic being by nature. It desires justice and has some avenue to follow this pursuit. Yet, Frankenstein's monster as a literary concept is rejected by society. While superheroes that preceded the Human Torch were, for the most part, human, or at least human adjacent, or able to be passed off as human in any other context, the Human Torch as a character was the first where his appearance was distinctly not human. Regardless for its want for connection and justice and giving back to the people, he is fundamentally rejected. This is a connection between both Frankenstein and the Human Torch. As one Phil Sheldon, who is the main point of view character for Marvels, and also there during the first showing of the Human Torch, he says, "That thing, it looked at me like a person would." This poses the Human Torch not as an android, not as a human, not as a superhero, but as a thing. Pun completely intended. Not a superhero in the traditional sense, but a monster. Synthetic, but not human. As written by John Durman on Analogies to Amaze, as the Human Torch's very appearance of a living man on fire is so contradictory to the social structure he entered, he lacks classification, and thereby must be categorized as indefinable, as a monster. For so early in the history of superhero publishing, it is incredibly interesting that Marvel's first hero was so distinctly not human, where these characters are framed as protectors of humanity. So many heroes make an active choice to separate themselves from their humanity when fighting crime or doing superhero work. Batman and Superman both have secret identities. Their superhero-ness, or what makes them unique, and their humanness are seen as separate facets of their being. Jim Hammond, of course, has a secret identity, but by very nature, he is a monster. He is a Frankenstein's creature. He knows that he is a monster, but seeks the welfare of his community regardless. I think that this is a fundamental building block in the superhero mythos that, to be frank, isn't talked about enough. It is an element which is largely out of the discussion. Jim Hammond will make sparse appearances in media. Only recently, in the Ultimate series of comics, he's had more of a major role. in said run, he has become a member of the titular team. Most notably, he is now canonically credited with the murder of Adolf Hitler in universe, a fixation on his modern appearance in the Ultimates comics. Yet, if I say Human Torch, the vast majority of people in this audience will directly think about Johnny Storm, a member of the Fantastic Four. Johnny Storm has had not only one, not only two, but three, and you could argue 4 live-action interpretations. He appears in cartoons and in games. He is the character to think about if I talk about the Human Torch. That, as a fact, has always resonated weirdly with me. How come a character that came on later down the line is still considered in higher discussion when there is an original? Why does this version of the character become more popular than its predecessor? This is the question that I hope to answer with this essay. So, as of writing and recording this, there is a Fantastic Four movie on its way. This film features notably Chilean sweetheart Pedro Pascal, but also Joseph Quinn as the Human Torch. So let me give you some quick background of the Human Torch as a character. The Human Torch is a founding member of Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four. When developing the team, Jack Kirby decided to reuse the Jim Hammond Human Torch character when creating the Fantastic Four, and hence used his title and design for the character of Johnny Storm. Jim Hammond as the Human Torch would be in canon deactivated right at the end of the golden age of Marvel Comics, and would only be revived much later in 1966, meaning that for over 10 years, the Human Torch as Jim Hammond was dead, and the only version that remained was Johnny Storm. Yet, as time has gone on, the Human Torch as a character is way more synonymous with Johnny Storm. See, I'm not a Johnny Storm detractor. I find him entertaining, and I think he adds a fresh balance to Marvel's first family. Instead, I find that Jim Hammond as a character is more interesting and seemingly has more potential, especially that he has a longer publishing history and a more interesting historical significance. This might seem like a weird analogy for this one, but I think about Cain and Abel sometimes when thinking of the story. This is the story where Cain, the firstborn, murdered his brother Abel, the secondborn, when God favored Abel's gift in a bout of jealousy. In my mind, there is something distinctly Cainian about Johnny Storm taking the mantle of the Human Torch, stealing the title of Human Torch and conceptually killing Jim Hammond until he was revived way later down the line. Where there is a point of divergence, however, is that Johnny Storm is not the firstborn but the secondborn to the Human Torch name. Also, seemingly, there is very little jealousy involved. I feel in this context that there is more of a conceptual jealousy, a theft in a direct conceptual sense. In addition, where Cain and Abel seek recognition from God, we as the audience are posed as God in this framework. I think about it in the sense of supplanting his role as a conceptual murder in some sense. And there is something deeply tragic in this, that the android who was created to resemble man was eventually supplanted by man, that Jim Hammond could have seemingly never contended with Johnny Storm. Machine against man. The future catching up with Jim Hammond and being phased out with something better in every way possible. In modern iterations of Jim Hammond, there is a fixation on how phased out the Human Torch is as a character. In the Ultimate series, one of his defining character traits is that he has a limited amount of memory storage, and that he has to erase certain memories to make space for new ones. His age and temporality are then framed as essential frames of understanding for Jim Hammond. They are essential character traits, a constant reminder that he is outdated. What I find, I think, maybe frustrating is that I find Jim Hammond more interesting on a conceptual basis. He's closer to a creature of horror than a superhero, and that by itself is a more enticing concept. Johnny Storm, on the other hand, comes from a different literary tradition. He is derived from the mythological strongmen and tricksters, which in some sense tie Johnny Storm a little bit closer to the mythological Ubermensch and the Superman concept that I was talking about earlier. Jim Hammond and Johnny Storm serve different roles, both fundamentally and historically. Yet, for this character to be the first in its publishing history, and maybe the first in this style of writing, to be then later supplanted with a more traditional version of this concept, feels deeply tragic. That Jim Hammond was robbed of his position, that he became conceptually outdated. I sometimes think that maybe he was a little bit too shocking for the public. This image of him burning and running into the night. I sometimes wonder if him being supplanted plays into the fear that the public held about the Human Torch. The writers themselves might have fallen for the point of the character, that people are afraid of what they don't understand and they are ready to put it in a concrete prison. Outdated on a conceptual basis, a conceptual Frankenstein's monster. I think even more tragic is that there is very little chance that we will get a large fixation of this character. He is no longer in the limelight. Of course, Jim Hammond has now a very big role in the Ultimates comics, but that seems only temporary. He has also been name-dropped or made a cameo in related media. Instead, the most prominent way that we still experience this character is through the character of the Vision. The Vision as a character is made from the deactivated body of the Human Torch. In the comic where this happens, Ultron, a robot created by Hank Pym, steals the Human Torch and forces Dr. Horton to remake him as a weapon for Ultron. To remake the Human Torch into the Vision, dyeing his skin red and giving him a different set of abilities. Before the android can be fully mind-wiped, Dr. Horton and the Torch attempt to escape. However, the Doctor is shot down, and Jim Hammond is forced to hold his father and creator in his arms as he passes away. The Torch's memories would then be completely wiped out and replaced with a different character's memories, Wonder Man. Still, there is some essence of Jim Hammond that still lives within Vision. After a short stint of being a villain, he would later be reformed and become a superhero and follow in the steps of Jim Hammond in justice. This moment even more fundamentally follows the line of the Frankenstein story. Much like at the end of Mary Shelley's novel, and spoiler alerts, Victor Frankenstein passes away and only seconds later his monster seemingly also dies and goes back into the darkness. Human Torch and Dr. Horton seemingly follow the same line. They follow this story. The maybe subversion or interpretation of the story that comes with Jim Hammond and Dr. Horton is that Dr. Horton, in contrast to Victor Frankenstein, legitimately loved his creature and in his final moments tried to save him and even put his own life on the line, not out of a selfish need but for a true love for Jim Hammond. Jim Hammond being white is a metaphorical death of the character, and then being remade into the Vision is a fundamental rebirth. So the Vision as a character is incredibly Christ-like in some sense. A lot of the fixation around this character is his creation and death. The idea of rebirth is central to the Vision's story. In the MCU, when someone asks for the Vision's name, the Vision replies with, "I am," a direct biblical reference. In addition, this idea that the Vision is a rebirth of the Human Torch adds to this Christ-like analogy. Later on in the comics and in the MCU, the Vision would die again and be rebirthed as the White Vision, meaning that he has not had only one resurrection but two resurrections canonically. Seemingly, rebirth is a fundamental character element in the Vision. He is in some way a Messiah-esque, Christ-adjacent creature with superhuman abilities. Strangely though, Frankenstein is also sometimes framed as a Christ allegory. Victor Frankenstein actively attempts to play God and creates life and his son, which in some interpretations of the text actively mirrors the birth of Jesus. Of course, there are more simple interpretations in the more Adam-esque version of the character and the self-mentioned sort of paradise lost version of Lucifer, but that's for a whole different video. But needless to say, there is a Christ-like interpretation to the version of Victor Frankenstein's monster. However, while the Human Torch is a Frankenstein's monster, a creature to be sympathized with even through his difference and monstrous appearance, the Vision is a Messiah-like being. The paradox in Jim Hammond is that he has been supplanted not only once, but twice. Yet his presence looms over the entirety of the Marvel Universe. The mantle of Human Torch was conceptually passed down to Johnny Storm, and his body was passed down to Vision. They are both seeming elaborations and extensions of the character of Jim Hammond. Yet, Jim Hammond has very little presence in modern media. How can his presence loom so large over these two characters that have such a large presence, yet he doesn't make a single appearance or is only mentioned in passing? I think my frustration lies in this. The character who I believe is so interesting on a conceptual and historical level does not have the limelight. It's just something that I have to deal with. The more that I think about it, I think that the Human Torch ran its course. It ran its narrative course. Jim Hammond's character arc on a fundamental level ended with its inspiration. Frankenstein's monster's character arc. His creator is dead, and so he must die. In addition, his mantle and his body have been passed down, so even then, while he as a character might be dead, he still lives in some metaphorical sense. The Human Torch lives, not in a literal sense, but instead through name and through spirit and synthetic flesh. The torch, seemingly, has been passed. Also, he still lives through complicated comic logic.